The Last Tenant. In 2010, Clara moved into a charming old apartment in a quiet part of town. The rent was surprisingly affordable for such a spacious unit, but the landlord, an older man named Mr. Benson, seemed eager to rent it quickly. When Clara asked why the previous tenant had left, he hesitated before replying, "People come and go. It's just how it is." The apartment had a peculiar layout, with a narrow hallway leading to a locked storage room. Clara tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. She called Mr. Benson, who said the key had been lost for years, and that she shouldn't worry about it. "That room's been sealed since the building was renovated," he said. His casual tone didn't sit well with her, but she let it go. The first week was uneventful, aside from the occasional creak of old floorboards and distant sounds from neighboring units. One night, while unpacking, Clara heard faint tapping. It seemed to come from the locked storage room. Assuming it was pipes or settling wood, she ignored it. But the tapping grew louder. Over the next few days, it turned into knocking, always at night. Clara pressed her ear to the door, convinced it was a raccoon or stray animal trapped inside. She called Mr. Benson again, who dismissed her concerns. "Old buildings make noise," he said. "Don't worry about it." One evening, Clara noticed something odd. No matter where she stood in the apartment, she felt as though she was being watched. The feeling was strongest in the hallway near the locked door. That night, she woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps pacing the hall. Terrified, she grabbed her phone and crept out of bed. The hallway light flickered, and for a split second, she thought she saw a shadow standing near the door. The next morning, Clara decided to investigate. She borrowed a crowbar from a neighbor and pried the door open. The room was empty, just dusty shelves and a few broken pieces of furniture. Relieved but uneasy, she closed the door and decided to put it out of her mind. That night, the knocking returned, louder than ever. This time, it was accompanied by a faint, raspy whisper. Clara couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone, or something, was calling her name. She fled the apartment and stayed with a friend. The following day, Clara demanded answers from Mr. Benson. His face turned pale, and he avoided her gaze. "I didn't think it would happen again," he muttered. When Clara pressed him, he finally confessed. Years ago, a tenant named Eleanor had lived in the apartment. She was a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors. One day, the landlord entered the unit after weeks of unanswered calls and found her lifeless body in the storage room. She had barricaded herself inside, scribbling frantic messages on the walls. "It's watching me. It won't let me leave." The coroner ruled it a suicide, but Mr. Benson always felt there was more to the story. Clara was horrified. She returned to the apartment to gather her belongings and leave for good. As she packed, she heard a single, deafening knock on the storage room door. Gathering her courage, she opened it one last time. The walls were no longer bare. Scratched into the wood in jagged, frantic letters was a single word repeated over and over: "Stay." Clara never went back. Weeks later, the building was condemned after multiple tenants reported similar disturbances. To this day, the apartment remains empty, the locked room untouched. Locals say that on quiet nights, you can hear the tapping, an unrelenting plea for company from whatever still lingers inside. As Clara tried to move on with her life, the events of the apartment haunted her dreams. Each night, she would wake up drenched in sweat, visions of the word "stay" carved into her mind. She told herself it was over. The apartment was behind her. but the eerie sensation of being watched seemed to follow her, even in her new home. One night, weeks after moving into a cheerful studio across town, Clara woke up abruptly. The air felt thick, suffocating. Her clock read 3:33 a.m. A faint noise broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Her heart froze. It was coming from the closet. She stared at the closed closet door, every instinct telling her to stay in bed. But as the tapping continued, louder and more deliberate, she felt compelled to act. Grabbing her phone for light, Clara approached the door with trembling hands. She flung it open, but there was nothing inside. Just clothes hanging neatly and boxes stacked on the floor. Before she could close the door, her phone flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. In the pitch black, she heard it. A raspy, disembodied whisper. This time, the words were unmistakable. "You can't leave." She slammed the closet door shut and bolted to her bed, pulling the covers over her head like a frightened child. The tapping stopped, but the room felt unnervingly quiet, as though the very air had been sucked out. Clara stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to move. The next morning, Clara tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was stress, maybe leftover trauma from the apartment, she thought. She spent the day researching the history of her new building, but nothing unusual came up. She even called Mr. Benson, demanding to know if the haunting in her old apartment could somehow follow her. He sounded genuinely surprised but unhelpful. "I've heard of spirits clinging to people," he said hesitantly, "but I never thought, just be careful." That night, Clara made sure all the lights were on and called a friend to stay over. They stayed up talking, trying to drown out her fears with laughter and movies. Just as they were starting to relax, the power went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. Her friend joked nervously, but Clara knew better. The tapping began again. This time, it was on the bedroom window. Her friend, confused and uneasy, pulled back the curtain to look outside. The street below was empty, but on the glass, fogged by the chill of the night, were smeared handprints. A loud crash from the closet made them both scream. Clara's friend grabbed a flashlight from her bag, and they cautiously approached the door. Clara could feel the oppressive weight in the air, the same presence she had felt in the old apartment. Her friend flung the closet door open and immediately froze. Inside, scratched into the back wall, was the same word Clara had seen before: "Stay." Beneath it, in fresh, jagged scratches, were the words, "You brought me." Clara screamed and ran, dragging her friend out of the apartment. They spent the rest of the night in her friend's car, parked far from the building. The next morning, Clara called a paranormal investigator, desperate for answers. The investigator, an older woman named Evelyn, listened to Clara's story with a grim expression. "Spirits like this aren't tied to places," Evelyn explained. "They're tied to energy, fear, trauma, desperation. It sounds like this one latched onto you because you reacted to it. It thrives on attention and fear." Evelyn performed a cleansing ritual on Clara and her belongings, warning her to stay strong and avoid feeding the entity with her terror. For a while it seemed to work. The tapping stopped, the whispers faded, and Clara began to feel like herself again. But late one night, as she lay in bed, she felt a cold breath against her ear. A voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered, "You can't escape me." The lights in her room flickered, and the tapping resumed. this time coming from all around her. Clara froze in her bed, paralyzed by the realization that the entity had never truly left. The sound of the tapping grew louder, reverberating from every wall, every corner of the room. It was relentless, like 100 fingers drumming in perfect rhythm. She clutched the covers to her chest, her breath shallow and rapid. Desperate, she scrambled for her phone to call Evelyn, but the screen remained eerily dark, refusing to turn on. As she tried to summon the courage to move, the air in the room grew colder, and a sinister chuckle filled the space around her. "You thought you were rid of me," the voice mocked, disembodied and resonant. "You gave me power, Clara. You made me strong." The walls seemed to close in, shadows twisting and writhing like living things. Clara's mind raced. She remembered Evelyn's advice. Show no fear. But how could she suppress the terror coursing through her veins? She forced herself to sit up, her legs trembling beneath the blanket. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't control me." The laughter grew louder, mocking her attempts at defiance. "You called me. You fed me. Now you'll never be free." Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara sprang from the bed and turned on the bedroom light. The sudden brightness momentarily dissipated the oppressive darkness, but the figure now standing in the corner of the room made her blood run cold. It was tall and gaunt, its form barely human. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing her with malevolent glee. Clara screamed and grabbed the small crucifix she kept on her bedside table. She held it out toward the entity, her hands shaking violently. "Leave me alone," she shouted. "You have no power here." The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned closer, its face contorted in a grotesque grin. "Oh, but I do, Clara. You invited me in when you opened that door, when you listened, when you let me in your mind." In a moment of desperation, Clara remembered Evelyn's cleansing instructions. She darted to her closet, grabbing the bundle of sage and matches Evelyn had left for her. As she lit the sage, thick smoke began to fill the room. The creature recoiled slightly, its form flickering like a faulty hologram. Clara began reciting the words Evelyn had taught her, her voice gaining strength with each repetition. "I command you to leave this place. You are not welcome. Return to the void and trouble me no more." The room shook violently, and the creature let out an ear-piercing scream. The shadows clawed at the walls, retreating toward the corner where the entity had first appeared. With one final guttural roar, the figure exploded into a cloud of black mist, which was quickly consumed by the smoke of the sage. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. The oppressive weight that had lingered for months was gone. The air felt light, clean, as if a storm had finally passed. Evelyn arrived the next morning to find Clara sitting in her living room, surrounded by lit candles and the remnants of the sage bundle. After hearing what had happened, Evelyn gave her a knowing nod. "You fought back," she said. "That's the only way to reclaim your life. But you must remain vigilant. Some entities are resilient." Clara eventually moved again, this time to a new city. She kept the crucifix close and performed regular cleansing rituals, refusing to let the memory of the entity dictate her life. The haunting left her shaken but not broken, a survivor of a nightmare she would never forget. But every now and then, in the stillness of the night, Clara thought she could hear faint tapping, as if reminding her that the darkness was never far away.